Welcome back to Unboxed. It's time for yet another big benchmark video, so strap yourself in. Last week, NVIDIA released the GeForce GTX 1070 Ti, and I suffered through the launch with some kind of flu virus. But the good news is I've just about fully recovered now. Because I was sick though, that did limit my time and energy. I had to throw out the release day coverage. So I promised you that I would put together a 34 game benchmark comparing the GTX 1070 Ti and 9 other GPUs. And well, this is that video. I've actually added a 35th game, and that is Call of Duty World War II. All 35 games were tested at 1080p, 1440p and 4K resolutions, and this means that we have a grand total of 105 graphs comprising of 1155 individual benchmark runs. The results, as always, are based on an average of 3 runs, and so that means there's 3,465 runs in total, or, well, at least that amount anyway. This took weeks of work to gather, and the issue I now face is how to present all this data without taking up a week of your time. So what we're going to do here is focus on a dozen of the most recently released and most interesting games, and then look at a number of head-to-head comparisons based on all 35 games. You know, those massive graphs you guys seem to really love that I usually show at the end of the big benchmark comparisons. Anyway, because I have exported and manually highlighted the GPUs that we're discussing on all 105 graphs, I've decided to include them all at the end of this video with a bit of background music, so consider it kind of like showing the workings out, if you will, for you guys that are interested to see how the frame rates looked in individual games at certain resolutions. You can go and check those at the end of the video. Anyway, first up we have 12 games to closely look at before jumping into the full breakdown graphs. Before that though, a few quick notes on testing. The latest AMD and NVIDIA drivers were used, and all tests were conducted on my new Core i7-8700K test system. Previously, many of these results were gathered on my 7700K test system, but they've been since retested on the 8700K, and many of them went unchanged, but I did see a couple of big changes in games such as Ashes of the Singularity, for example. So that pretty much covers all the boring stuff. It's now time to jump into the results. Kickstarting things, we have the Call of Duty World War II results, starting with the 1080p resolution. Now, right away, you've no doubt noticed something a bit odd here. All the Radeon-based graphics cards are stuck at an average of 91 FPS. This is obviously a driver issue, as Vega 64 liquid-cooled should be quite a lot faster than an RX 580, for example. In fact, all the AMD GPUs were slower than the GTX 1060 at this resolution. Moving to 1440p, we again find that the Radeon GPUs are limited to around 90 FPS on average, though this time the RX 580 does drop off a little bit. Still, because of this issue, the GTX 1070 Ti is a little over 20% faster than the Vega 56 graphics card before we even bother to overclock it. Finally, at the extreme 4K resolution, that apparent 90 FPS cap of the AMD GPUs is no longer an issue, as there is no single GPU here able to achieve that level of performance. Even so, NVIDIA still has the edge in this title, at least when comparing the GTX 1070 Ti and Vega 56 GPUs. Here the GTX 1070 Ti was 8% faster, while it was possible to extract a further 11% via overclocking. Moving on, we have Assassin's Creed Origins, and here we have another new title that looks to be favouring the green team. The GTX 1070 Ti provided 9% more frames than Vega 56, and this meant at 1080p it was pushing well over 60 FPS at all times. The margin is diminished at 1440p, and here the 1070 Ti was just 7% faster when comparing the average frame rate. That said though, the minimum result weighed heavily in the green team's favour. Then finally, at 4K, the 1070 Ti was just 3% faster with an average of 36 FPS, though again, it was a good bit faster for the minimum frame rate. That said, with less than 40 FPS on average, neither GPU was particularly impressive at the 4K resolution when using the very high quality preset. Next up, we have the new Wolfenstein game, Wolfenstein II, the new Colossus. Like Doom, this title supports the Vulkan API, so you might expect the AMD GPUs to do very well. Here Vega 56 is able to outpace the GTX 1070 Ti even once the NVIDIA GPU is overclocked. That said though, things do change slightly at 1440p, and here Vega 56 is just 7% faster than the stock GTX 1070 Ti. This time overclocking the 1070 Ti places it on par with the Vega GPU. Impressively, both GPUs are averaging over 100 FPS using the maximum in-game quality preset. Then finally, at 4K, we are still able to achieve very playable performance. Again, Vega 56 is still slightly faster when comparing both GPUs at their default operating frequencies. Both Vega 56 and the GTX 1070 Ti performed very well in F1 2017, though this time the green team has a clear advantage in this DirectX 11 title. The margins aren't huge, but out of the box the 1070 Ti is faster than Vega 56, though the Vega graphics card does beat the plain old 1070. The margins close up at 1440p, and though the 1070 Ti is still faster, there's now just a few frames in it, so not really much to talk about there. Again, this is a title where previously, or I suppose still currently, AMD's Vega 56 does enjoy a win over the 1070. The 1070 Ti, though, does tip things back in Nvidia's favour. Then finally, at the extreme 4K resolution, the GTX 1070 Ti remains in the lead, though again, there really isn't that much in it. Middle-earth: Shadow of War is another recently released title, and this one plays very nicely with AMD hardware. As a result, Vega 56 is faster than even the GTX 1070 Ti, at least a stock GTX 1070 Ti. Here, the red team enjoyed a 12% performance advantage over the vanilla 1070 at 1080p and 3% over the new Ti model. Similar margins were seen at 1440p, though this time I should note that overclocking the GTX 1070 Ti did boost the frame rates by 11%, and consequently this meant that it was 6% faster than the stock Vega 56 GPU. Then for those gaming at the 4K resolution, you will need to reduce the quality preset, as the GTX 1070 Ti and Vega 56 GPUs were only good for like 40 FPS. Jumping back in the cockpit, this time for Project Cars 2, we find another racing simulator that prefers its cars with a shade of green. At 1080p, the stock out-of-the-box GTX 1070 Ti matched the Vega 64 liquid-cooled graphics card, while overclocking placed the $450 GeForce graphics card within the 1080 Ti's slipstream. I should note though, thanks to what is a fairly obvious CPU bottleneck, that slow 8700K at 5GHz is unfortunately the culprit here. Jumping to 1440p, the CPU bottleneck is alleviated as the GPU has much more to deal with now. The margin between Vega 56 and the GTX 1070 Ti grew ever so slightly, and now the GeForce graphics card is 13% faster out of the box. Then finally, at the 4K resolution, the margin again grows, and now the GTX 1070 Ti is 15% faster than Vega 56, and as a consequence is now hot on the heels of Vega 64 liquid-cooled once again. Moving on, now we have Destiny 2 to check out, and things look very similar to what we saw when testing the beta out last month. By that I mean this game pretty much favours hardware from the green team. That said though, previously the GTX 1070 did beat Vega 56 by a pretty handy margin, and now Vega is slightly ahead, so AMD has made some improvements. Unfortunately though, for AMD, since then, Nvidia has of course released the GTX 1070 Ti, and that kind of hides some of the gains they've made with Vega 56. Having said that though, at 1440p, things really do turn around for the Radeon GPUs, and here we can see Vega 56 beating the GTX 1070 Ti even once it's overclocked, so that's a very interesting and certainly very impressive result for AMD. What's more interesting though are the 4K results, as here AMD continues to gain momentum, and now Vega 56 is 15% faster than the overclocked GTX 1070 Ti. In fact, Vega 64 liquid-cooled is able to match the GTX 1080 Ti, and well, you don't see that too often. Total War Warhammer 2 was tested using the DirectX 12 API, and this should give AMD a slight advantage. That said, Nvidia's drivers already appear to be pretty much up to speed and working well in this title, and as a result the GTX 1070 Ti is just 3% slower than Vega 56 at 1080p. So I think we should probably increase the resolution, as we've already done numerous times, and see if that pushes things further in AMD's favour, like what we saw with Destiny 2. Well, this time things actually close up at the 1440p resolution, and now Vega 56 and the stock GTX 1070 Ti deliver virtually the same performance. This is again also seen at the 4K resolution, as both GPUs deliver an average of 24 FPS. Hellblade's built upon the Unreal 4 engine, and typically this engine favours NVIDIA hardware, and we can certainly see that here. The GTX 1070 Ti was a whopping 19% faster than the Vega 56 in what was one of the most convincing wins for NVIDIA yet. The margin though is reduced ever so slightly at 1440p, and now the GTX 1070 Ti is 16% faster. Even before the 1070 Ti arrived though, NVIDIA's plain old 1070 had AMD more than covered in this title. Again, we see similar margins even at the extreme 4K resolution though. As usual, those gaming here will want to reduce the quality settings if they plan on using either a Vega 56 or GTX 1070 Ti type graphics card. Another game released this year that also uses the Unreal 4 game engine is PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and this is yet another title that prefers NVIDIA hardware. It's not exactly a well-built title though, or it's certainly not optimized, at least to the degree that you would expect from a title of its popularity, let's say. And, well, I really only include it because of how popular it is. The GTX 1070 Ti led Vega 56 by 32% margin. That's not exactly the norm, but it's still a disappointing result for AMD in this hugely popular title. As we often see, the margin is reduced at 1440p. That said, it's still quite a massive margin in favour of the GeForce graphics card, as here it was 28% faster. Then at the 4K resolution, the 1070 Ti was 24% faster, but it hardly matters at this point, with almost every graphics card tested struggling to achieve 30 frames per second. From a terribly optimized game to an extremely well optimized game, we now have the Prey results. This game's provided us with plenty of competitive results in the past, and this is again true here, though the updated GTX 1070 Ti now has the rendering power to pull ahead of Vega 56. The results though are quite interesting, as with the 1070 Ti you do get the minimum frame rate of the GTX 1080, but the average result is much closer to the GTX 1070, so that's quite curious. For the most part, the margins though were much the same at 1440p. Here the GTX 1070 Ti led Vega 56 by a 10% margin, while it enjoyed a 12% boost once overclocked. Then at 4K the margins remain much the same though, now we're seeing frame rates in the 40s. The last game that we're going to have a close look at is Dirt 4, and we found that this title does heavily favour the red team when using any anti-aliasing method other than the ultra-heavy 8x MSAA. I've always used CMAA as it looks quite good and it's not very taxing on performance. Here Vega 56 buries the GTX 1070 Ti, and it does seem like NVIDIA's driver team are unable to make up this massive deficit. At 1440p the margin is reduced, but even so Vega 56 was 17% faster than the stock GTX 1070 Ti. Finally at 4K Vega 56 seems to choke a little, and now the GTX 1070 Ti is able to match its performance with 61 FPS. This is quite an impressive result for these graphics cards at this extreme resolution. Lastly, just a quick recap on power consumption. We looked at this a few days ago in the day one coverage of the GTX 1070 Ti, and there are a few more cards, let's say, in that comparison than there is here. So if you want a bit more detail, go back and check that. Anyway, as you can see, the power consumption between Vega 56 and the GTX 1070 Ti when comparing full system draw is very similar. Obviously, the Pascal-based 1070 Ti is much more efficient as it was faster overall, but managed to draw less power. Right, so we've now looked at 36 of the 105 graphs. Let's skip the rest now and break down the data I've gathered from all 35 games. I've mostly focused on the 1440p resolution, as I feel this is the most relevant for GPUs of this caliber. Overclocking really wasn't the focus of this video, and I realise I didn't overclock Vega 56, so it's not an overclocking comparison. That said though, you kind of have to overclock the 1070 Ti for it to make sense. Otherwise, you might as well just spend a little extra on the 1080 or save a bit and get the 1070. Anyway, as you can see here, once overclocked, the GTX 1070 Ti produces on average around 11% more frames, which isn't bad. It's certainly worth the small amount of effort it takes to achieve. Of course, the gains will vary quite a bit depending on the title used for testing, but as you can see, for the most part, you will see double-digit gains. When compared to MSI's factory overclocked GTX 1070 Gaming X graphics card, the stock GTX 1070 Ti was on average just 8% faster, which might seem a bit surprising given that the 1070 Ti packs 27% more CUDA cores. There are, however, two reasons why that margin might be smaller than expected. Firstly, the MSI Gaming X version of the GTX 1070 features a factory overclock, whereas the 1070 Ti doesn't, so this does help reduce the margin. The other reason being that the GTX 1070 Ti is memory starved, and this means all those extra CUDA cores aren't really being utilized as effectively as they should be. Overclocking the 1070 Ti's memory really does help out, as you're about to see. Now, with my custom overclock applied, the 1070 Ti is 20% faster than the MSI's GTX 1070 Gaming X model. In fact, we're now seeing up to a 28% gain in titles such as For Honor, F1 2017, Doom, and The Division. With both the 1070 and 1070 Ti overclocked to the max, the Ti model should be, I would say, at least 15% faster on average. Overclocked, the 1070 Ti is also able to deliver factory overclocked GTX 1080 Lite performance as it matched the MSI Gaming X model. They were evenly matched in 6 of the games tested, while the overclocked 1070 Ti was faster in 11 games, albeit by just a 1 to 2% margin in most of them. Additionally, the 1070 Ti was never more than 5% slower, so you can safely say it delivers at least stock GTX 1080 performance once overclocked. In my big 32 game Vega benchmark video that I did a few months ago now, I found that Vega 56 was on average 5% faster than the GeForce GTX 1070 Founders Edition. At the time, I noted that the factory overclocked custom board partner versions of the GTX 1070 would be around 5% faster than the Founders Edition model, so overall the 1070 and Vega 56 graphics cards would deliver similar performance. Well, this time for the 35 game benchmark, which includes many new and previously untested games, I've used the MSI Gaming X version of the GTX 1070, and here we see it was just 1% slower than Vega 56 on average, so that's about what I was expecting to find. Newly released titles that helped AMD out included Wolfenstein II, Shadow of War, Warhammer 2, and Destiny 2. The big wins for Nvidia came from PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, Mass Effect Andromeda, and the newly released Call of Duty World War II title. So prior to the GTX 1070 Ti's release, AMD were still hanging in there with a pretty close head-to-head battle with the factory overclocked 1070s. However, if we now swap to the 1070 Ti, we find that on average this new GeForce GPU was 6% faster at 1440p. In fact, the 1070 Ti was faster in 25 of the 30 games tested and only suffered a double-digit loss in Dirt 4 and Destiny 2. So in today's games, it's fair to say that for the most part, the GeForce GTX 1070 Ti is the superior GPU. Before wrapping things up, I also checked out the margins at 1080p, and here the 1070 Ti made out a little better. It's certainly the better option for those seeking extreme frame rates at this resolution. The only game to really hurt the 1070 Ti was again Dirt 4, but for those that would claim this is an outlier and it skews the results, I can tell you that it doesn't. That's the beauty of testing with so many games, of course. Removing Dirt 4 does only change the margin by 8%. And that said, if we remove Call of Duty World War II, unsurprisingly, we're back to a 7% margin. And then finally we have the 4K resolution, and in my opinion, neither of these GPUs are really capable of 4K gaming, but here are the results anyway. The GTX 1070 Ti was 6% faster on average at this extreme resolution. Again, the 1070 Ti was faster in the majority of the games tested. Well, is there anything else that needs to be said? I guess at this point, it pretty much comes down to pricing and availability. Performance-wise, you're looking at around 6% on average, and that's the difference between these two cards. And again, that is just the average difference across the 35 games tested. So if you plan on playing a shipload of PUBG, for example, the GTX 1070 Ti is the obvious choice. It was 28% faster at 1440p in that title. That said though, if you're going to mostly play something like Destiny 2, then perhaps Vega 56 would be the way to go, as the 1070 Ti was 11% slower in that title. That said though, I think if you're going to play a mix of games, and that's probably sort of realistic for most of you guys, you're not just going to stick to one title. I know some people do, but yeah. Anyway, if you're going to play a mix of titles, and I think it's safe to say that the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1070 Ti is the best bet right now. As always, I suggest you look at the performance in the games that interest you to work out which brand's going to serve you best. Keeping the performance figures in the back of the old noggin, let's talk moolah. In a post-cryptocurrency mining apocalypse when MSRPs actually mean something again, the GTX 1070 Ti should cost $450 US, the GTX 1070 $380 US, and the GTX 1080 $500 US. And finally, Vega 56 should cost around $400 US. Actually, to my surprise, at the time of creating this video, it was possible to buy a Vega 56 graphics card for $400 US and a GTX 1070 Ti for $450 US. What kind of madness is this? Hopefully this is still the case when you watch this video. I kind of don't believe it, but over at Amazon and Newegg, those are the prices I'm currently seeing. This means the GTX 1070 Ti costs around 13% more than a reference Vega 56 graphics card, and honestly, that makes picking between the two a bit of a challenge. Here in Australia, the pricing is much the same for both models. You can expect to pay around $700 to $750 Aussie. So keeping those prices in mind, I'm not really sure why the GTX 1070 Ti has been copping so much hate, especially from some of the big name reviewers out there. Sure, I'll admit it's unexciting, and I did say this in my day one review, but right now it is only $40 US more than a 1070, and that's 10% more, and with both overclocked, it is around 15% faster. That's hardly exciting gains, I know, but for someone buying a new graphics card today, it is the better value option, at least for enthusiasts that are keen on overclocking. That said though, I can certainly understand the argument that if you're going to spend $450, why not just spend $500, or at the moment it's $510 to secure the GTX 1080. It is just 13% more after all at the $510 price. As I said in my review, the GTX 1070 Ti, it really does fill a gap that we didn't really need filled, but it seems Nvidia just doesn't want to give AMD an inch. In the end though, if I had to pick between a reference Vega 56 graphics card at $400 or a custom board partner GTX 1070 Ti at $450, I think I'd lean towards the GeForce graphics card for the simple fact that in most games it does provide superior performance, consumes less power, albeit only slightly less, runs cooler, and is a heck of a lot quieter. Operating volume really is the big issue for me with the reference Vega 56 graphics card. It's loud. I don't care what anyone says, it's bloody loud, and I certainly couldn't live with it. I am hoping to get my hands on a custom Vega 56 graphics card soon, but boy oh boy, it's not an easy task, and good luck if you're a consumer. In the end, I think the GTX 1070 Ti wins due to better availability, significantly more options for consumers to choose from, and better quality options at that. There is still hope for Vega, but with each passing month, that hope is dwindling, and I'd say AMD's GPU arm is now pretty much on life support. Everything would have to be hinged on the next generation, which could really make or break the Rodeon team. As it is, Nvidia's basically ganged up on Vega 56. The GTX 1070 was already really giving it a hard time on what was a bit of a back and forth fight, but now the GTX 1070 Ti has just shamelessly jumped into the ring to kick Vega while the 1070 holds it down. Vega 64 would no doubt like to step in and help, but it's already been drop punted across the ring by the GTX 1080, and the liquid cool model wet itself at the sight of the GTX 1080 Ti. I could go on with this story, but I'll spare you and stop here, and instead I'm going to hit you with 69 more graphs. And no, that wasn't intentional. Anyway, I'm your host, Steve. Again, sorry about my voice. It is getting better. I should be fully recovered in a few days' time, but until then, here is a truckload of blue bar graphs. Enjoy.